We're here to protest because our youth and friends are being killed. We are here to see that justice is done and the present regime is ousted. These words, spoken by a protester to the news outlet DW, perfectly captured the mood in Nepal, where since Monday, the 8th of September, young people have taken to the streets to demand change. What began as localized protests in Kathmandu's Matagar neighborhood quickly swelled, drawing in hundreds of thousands. By Tuesday, the city looked like a war zone. Haphazardly erected barricades, fires across major government installations, and the bullet-riddled bodies of protesters lying dead in the streets. The shockwaves have shaken the Nepalese government to its core. Prime Minister Khadga Sharma Oli resigned amid speculation that he was looking to flee to Dubai, and the country's political parties are scrambling to cobble together enough support to form the next government. As the remnants of the government try to navigate this crisis, the nation remains on edge, with protesters insisting that they won't accept anything short of sweeping political reforms. So, what pushed Nepal to the brink? And where might things go next? Lighting the match. All right, before we dive in, just a little bit of housekeeping, as we always have to do. All information in this video is up to date at the time of recording, noon 30, on Thursday Central European time. So if you're wondering why we didn't cover whatever major thing happened after that cutoff point, well, that's because our crystal ball is malfunctioning. I apologize. It's also not real. I wish it was real. With that out of the way, let's answer the first of our major questions. How did we end up in this mess? I mean, how did Nepal end up in this mess? To answer that question, you need to know a very key fact about Nepal, and that's that it is oh so staggeringly corrupt. Transparency International ranks Nepal 107th out of 180 countries in its Corruption Perception Index. That's far ahead of Russia, but right alongside Brazil and Serbia, places with entire Wikipedia pages on graft. It's not a good thing if your country's got one of those, is it? Nepalese youth, angry at the decades of corruption and the government's laughable attempts at stopping it, took to social media using the hashtag #NepoKids and #NepoBabies to criticize the children and families of influential politicians who they saw as the main beneficiaries of the graft. Now, if you're not chronically online, what all that's like, you might not be familiar with the term Nepo Baby. It originated in Hollywood as shorthand for kids whose careers were propelled more by their famous last names than their talent. Nepal co-opted the phrase, using it to juxtapose the stark differences between the lives of ordinary people and the children of the elite. The Times of London reported that Sagar Thapa, the son of politician Bindu Thapa, was one of the main targets of the hashtags. A picture of him posing in front of a Christmas tree made of over 30 luxury gift boxes from brands like Cartier, Louis Vuitton, and Gucci went viral. It was captioned, "While ordinary Nepalese send remittances from abroad to survive, Nepo babies build Christmas trees with stolen taxpayer money." Apparently taxpayer money that doesn't buy taste. The caption reveals another crucial aspect of Nepal's economic reality, the country's heavy reliance on money that workers abroad send back home. The scarcity of jobs has driven millions of young people to seek work in other countries. In Hong Kong, they power the electronics recycling industry, while in the United States, they form the fastest growing community of Asian Americans. In 2024, according to the New York Times, they sent back $11 billion, which accounts for a staggering, wait for it, 26% of the entirety of Nepal's economy. So how did the Nepalese government react to all of this corruption-related anger? Well, in a perfect world, we'd like to tell you that they went on a journey of introspection, reduced the number of ostentatious social media posts, and embarked on fixing the country's economy so that people were less reliant on remittances. Unfortunately, though, we live in the world where none of that happens. Instead, the government chose to ban social media, as if stopping people from posting about corruption would magically fix corruption. And this was, and we really cannot emphasize this enough, it was a really bad f***ing idea. Analysis from digital advisory firm KPIOS found that at the start of 2025, there were 14.3 million active social media user identities in Nepal. This is equivalent to about half of the country's population. And for those people, the internet, it's more than just memes, it's a lifeline. Quoting Dr. Nayana Prakash, a research fellow at Chatham House, there's been a sort of trivializing of what social media can mean to young people, both in this protest and across the world. Social media isn't just a way that we chat to our friends. It's a way that we feel connected to any kind of network in society, both locally and globally. In Nepal particularly, social media has become an important tool for the younger tech-savvy generation to find jobs and run businesses. For some, being on social media itself was a job. It's not a job. And there was a few fears that a ban would stop Facebook from launching content monetization in the country, something that does sound trivial until you realize that some people's future livelihoods hinged on it. I am so aware. Now, to be fair to the Nepalese government, this wasn't a blanket ban on social media. There were steps companies were meant to take, like registering with the government and appointing a local liaison officer to handle complaints that would exempt them. TikTok did exactly that, as did Viber, Nimbuzz, and Popo Live. So, simply calling it a social media ban strips away a lot of the nuance. Now, we should also be careful to give the government side here. From their perspective, they weren't trying to be a bunch of old men shaking their fists at those darn kids and their pesky phones. They were trying to limit the spread of misinformation and ensure that both the platforms and the users were responsible for the content that was produced. That being said, they gave social media companies a mere week to comply with the new rules. And then the shutdown started. Shutdowns that felt to Gen Zers like a collective punishment. And, well, collective punishments tend to breed collective anger. The protests. From the outside looking in, it's really tempting to view the protests in Nepal as simply an outburst of anger at the social media ban. However, that is really missing the wider point. Speaking exclusively to WarFronts, Dr. Caroline Mose, a scholar and governance expert, opines that while the social media ban was the trigger, the gun was paid for and loaded by state corruption. It's a point that the youth have emphasized. Eugen Rajmdari, a 24-year-old student, told the AFP, "We were triggered by the social media ban, but that is not the only reason we are gathered here. We are protesting against corruption that has been institutionalized in Nepal." On the first day, the protesters initially gathered in Kathmandu around Mehdigar Mandala, a monument built to showcase Nepalese culture. It's about a kilometer from Parliament. The first few hours were peaceful, with protesters, some of them school children, still in their uniforms, marching, chanting, and singing. Media outlet The Statesman reported that some of them were carrying a flag from the anime One Piece in scenes reminiscent of the recent Indonesian protests. The demonstrations, however, soon moved closer to Parliament, and some protesters climbed over the wall, attempting to breach the building. That's when, and we'll use a technical term here, all hell broke loose. An ambulance was set on fire, and riot police were pelted with stones. The police responded with water cannons, tear gas, and even live ammunition. The government imposed a curfew on New Baneshwar, the largest residential neighborhood in Kathmandu, but this did little to deter the protesters, who were enraged by the violent crackdown. By the end of the day, at least 19 people were dead, and more than 300 were injured. In the wake of this carnage, political parties such as the Nepali Congress, part of Prime Minister Ollie's ruling coalition, and the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist Centre, the country's main opposition party, issued statements calling for accountability. That a member of the ruling coalition would issue such a statement signaled to regional observers that it was a question of when, not if, the Prime Minister resigned. Ollie's coalition was held together by broken promises and fragile bargains, and the protests tore right through it. After an emergency cabinet meeting, during which Home Minister Ramesh Lakhak resigned, Prime Minister Ollie issued a statement blaming the violence on rogue elements that had infiltrated the protests. He further clarified that the government was not opposed to the demands of the youth and announced the end of the social media ban. But by now it's too late. Young Nepalese were lying dead in the streets. An already pissed-off generation now had reason to hate their government even more. With that in mind, what happened next seems almost inevitable. On Tuesday, demonstrators poured back into the streets. Unlike on Monday, this time things were violent from the outset. Protesters set fire to tires, threw stones at police in riot gear, and chased them through the narrow streets of Kathmandu. Catastrophic scenes unfolded as protesters burned down government buildings, including Parliament and the Supreme Court. Further, police stations and the houses of politicians were also targeted. Protesters then descended on Tribhuvan International Airport, where some politicians had been evacuated to stop them from leaving the country. Some took advantage of the chaos to attack jails across the nation, triggering a mass jailbreak. Nepalese police estimate that more than 13,000 inmates escaped. Rabi Lebachane, a controversial figure who briefly served as deputy prime minister, was among them. As the violence escalated, the prime minister resigned, fleeing to the Shiapuri barracks. His cabinet, though, they were not so lucky. In a video that's since gone viral, the nation's finance minister, Bishnu Prasad Paudel, can be seen running through the streets of Kathmandu with scores of people behind him. A young man kicks the minister down, sending him crashing into a wall. The minister quickly gets back up and continues running, and the video cuts off. Just one more time, that's the nation's finance minister. Subsequent videos show that he was caught, stripped naked, and beaten by angry protesters. Violence wasn't limited to the current government officials either. In Dalu, a suburb of Kathmandu, a mob burned down the house of former Prime Minister Jala Nath Kanal, killing his wife, who was trapped inside. In this way, the Nepalese protests went far beyond those seen in Indonesia. Their politicians' homes were trashed, but no one was lynched. No one's family members were burned alive. So perhaps it should be no surprise that the Nepalese crackdown was far harsher. Realizing the police could not maintain peace, President Ramchandra Patel, who holds a mostly ceremonial role within the country's parliament system, deployed the army. Within hours, a scene of uneasy calm had returned to Kathmandu, bar a few isolated incidents of looting. By Wednesday morning, even these pockets of disorder had been snuffed out, leaving the capital tense but quiet, and leaving much of the country asking, well, what comes next? What's next for Nepal? Whenever soldiers march into the streets during political crises, a familiar anxiety grips the hearts of most nations. Is this the prelude to a coup? And Nepal was certainly no different. As armored vehicles rolled through Kathmandu, rumors of a military takeover spread like wildfire. Brigadier General Raja Ram Basnet, the Nepalese army's spokesperson, was quick to dismiss these rumors. Speaking to Republic TV, he asserted that the army was not taking over, rather they were acting within the bounds of the constitution to normalize the situation and restore calm. Despite those assurances, skepticism still lingers. Public policy analyst Bishnu Rajapreti told Al Jazeera that although the president was nominally in charge, his lack of credibility among Gen Z protesters meant that the army was the nation's de facto power. So, if the military's not taking over, who actually is? Well, inside Nepal, much of the debate around this question is happening on social messaging platform Discord, ironically one of the apps that the government attempted to ban. Now, our team was able to gain access to one of the Discord servers that these conversations were happening in, and we saw in real time the attempts at consensus building. From these talks, one name rose to the top of the list: former Chief Justice Sushila Karki. One of Nepal's preeminent jurists, Karki has developed a reputation as an honest defender of the rule of law. She endeared herself to the protesters by marching alongside them and calling out the killing of protesters. However, she does face a major hurdle. According to Yograj Lamachane, an assistant professor at Nepal's Pokhara University, under the current constitutional framework, the next prime minister, even an interim one, needs to come from current members of parliament. It's the same hurdle that faces another popular option, Balendra Shah, the mayor of Kathmandu, and perhaps the most influential political figure in Nepal at the moment. Balan, as he is more popularly known, has publicly endorsed Karki and called for the president to dissolve parliament. The dissolution of parliament and holding new elections are among the core demands of the protesters, who, in the words of one person we spoke to, view the entire institution as unsalvageable. Other demands include the introduction of term limits for the prime minister, who, under the current constitution, can serve an indefinite number of 5-year terms, and a reduced term for parliament from 5 years down to 4. Some protesters have also suggested introducing a mechanism for the direct election of the prime minister. This would end the current system, where voters elect members of parliament, who then select a prime minister from within their ranks. If these demands are met, they could pave the way for Sushila Karki to become the nation's first female prime minister. However, they might also pave the way for a controversial figure to make a comeback. In the previous chapter, we introduced Rabi Lakshmane, the former deputy prime minister who escaped jail during the protests. He initially rose to power as a populist, an anti-corruption figure, but he later became mired in several corruption scandals. Despite this, he retained a significant base of support that has fronted him as a possible pick for interim prime minister. Supporters point to his long career in governance and past anti-corruption stances as evidence that he has what it takes to lead. Yet for all his support, Lamachane's chances of becoming prime minister are basically zero. Beyond the controversies that make him unpalatable to the youth, his very escape from prison has raised constitutional, ethical, and legal questions. Elevating him risks undermining the legitimacy of any transitional government and the protests as a whole. In the background of these debates, some Nepalese are discussing a more dramatic possibility: the return of the king. Isn't that a Lord of the Rings movie?
Now come the days of the king.
Former monarch Gyanendra Shah, who was deposed in 2008 when Nepal became a republic, has retained a loyal following. In early March, more than 10,000 supporters gathered near the main entrance to Kathmandu's Tribhuvan International Airport to welcome the king after a trip to western Nepal. Now, with the government reeling from the shock of the protests, the monarchists are trying to push the narrative that the king is the only one who can stabilize the country. Regardless of who becomes the next leader of Nepal, one thing is absolutely clear: they will have to shoulder not just the hopes of the protesters, but also the weight of a broken system. And if they fail, the protesters have proven more than capable of holding them accountable. Zooming out. So, stepping away from Nepal for a moment, we can see that these protests are not a unique phenomenon. In fact, what unfolded in Kathmandu echoes similar movements in the Philippines, Kenya, and Indonesia. In Manila, young Filipinos marched against corruption. In Nairobi, Kenya's Gen Z marched against a punitive finance bill, forcing the government to withdraw it. And in Jakarta, students flooded the streets to oppose exorbitant perks for MPs amidst a cost of living crisis. These pink protests, as people have taken to call them, share the same DNA. Young, educated, digitally savvy citizens disillusioned by what they see as systems that exist only to serve the elites. And it's not a problem that is limited to these countries. Across much of the global south, nations are having to reckon with a surging population of young people who have access to the internet and have learned from countries like Nepal that governments aren't invincible. So what happens next? If nothing changes, if the elites keep looting while the people continue to suffer, then the next wave of pink protests is all but guaranteed. Another wave of unrest that threatens to be even more spectacular than that seen in the summer of this year. Thank you for watching.